At my husband's funeral, my son-in-law whispered to my daughter, "Now we have to deal with the old woman." Before we get into the story, tell us in the comment section where you are watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your honest review. It was supposed to be the hardest day of my life. The sky wept with me that morning, gray clouds heavy with rain as I stood beneath a black umbrella, staring at the polished wood of my husband's casket. Raindrops tapped against the canopy above like the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock, each drop a reminder that time had run out for him and that life would never again be the same for me. My name is Margaret, 52 years old, newly widowed, and standing at the edge of a grave that seemed to swallow not just my husband's body, but the very foundation of my world. Around me, guests whispered their condolences. Some cried softly into handkerchiefs, while others stood in stiff silence, the way people do when they don't know what to say. But me, I wasn't listening to any of them. My mind was replaying every laugh, every argument, every quiet night at the dinner table with the man I loved. And still, I found the strength to step forward, to honor him. I clutched the folded paper in my hand, my eulogy. My final words for the man who had been my partner for 30 years. When I opened my mouth to speak, my voice trembled at first, but then it steadied, carried by love. I told them about his kindness, how he never passed a stranger without offering help, how he had been a pillar not just to me, but to our daughter, Sophia. I spoke of the sacrifices he made so she could have the education we could barely afford at the time. I spoke of his laughter, his stubbornness, his unwavering belief in family. As I spoke, I searched for comfort in the faces around me. Some nodded, some smiled through tears. But when my eyes fell on my daughter, my words faltered. Sophia stood rigidly, her hands clasped in front of her, her face expressionless. 27 years old, my only child, and yet in that moment, she looked like a stranger. Her eyes were dry, her lips pressed thin, as if she were merely enduring the moment rather than grieving. Beside her, her husband Daniel stood with a perfectly practiced solemnity. He had his arm draped around her shoulders, gently stroking her arm as if to soothe her. Anyone else might have thought it tender. But I knew better. Daniel was charming, yes, handsome, yes, but there was something too polished about him, too deliberate, like everything he did was part of a performance. Still, I forced myself to finish. I laid the folded paper on top of the casket and whispered goodbye one last time. The priest murmured his blessings, and then, with mechanical precision, the casket was lowered into the ground. My chest ached as the ropes groaned, slowly feeding the box of my husband's body to the wet earth. And then it happened, a whisper, soft, almost lost beneath the shuffle of feet and the patter of rain. Daniel leaned into my daughter, his lips brushing close to her ear, and I heard it. Clear as day. Now we have to deal with the old woman. For a moment, I thought the world had stopped. My lungs froze, my heart thundered in my ears. Did I hear that right? My mind screamed that I must have misheard. No one could possibly say something so cruel, so callous, here at a funeral. But the look on my daughter's face told me otherwise. She didn't flinch, she didn't scold him, she didn't even look shocked. She only gave the faintest nod, as if acknowledging something they had already discussed. And in that instant, the grief inside me twisted into something darker, suspicion. I told myself to breathe, to keep my face calm. No one must see the storm that was building inside me. So I bowed my head, clasped my hands, and let the priest's final words wash over me. But I was no longer listening, because all I could hear was that whisper. Now we have to deal with the old woman. I wanted to believe I had misheard, that my grief had conjured it. But as the mourners filed past me, offering hugs and murmured platitudes, I couldn't ignore what I saw out of the corner of my eye. Daniel's hand tightened around my daughter's waist. He leaned close again, his mouth hidden by her hair. And then, just for a second, I saw it. A smile, small, suppressed, shared between them like a secret. At my husband's funeral, my knees nearly buckled, but I straightened, forcing a mask of composure over my face. I thanked people for coming. I hugged relatives who told me to stay strong. But inside, a question burned like fire. Why? Why would my daughter, my own flesh and blood, allow her husband to speak of me that way? What did he mean? Deal with the old woman? Was I an obstacle to them? A burden? Or worse, was I a target? The rain kept falling, soaking into the earth where my husband now lay, and with every drop that hit the ground my resolve hardened. I had just buried the man who had been my shield, my partner, my greatest ally. And it seemed, on the very same day, I had uncovered something sinister brewing in the shadows of my own family. But if Daniel and my daughter thought that grief had made me weak, if they thought I would be easy to deal with, they were wrong. Very wrong. Because in that moment, I made a silent vow. They may see me as an old woman, but if they want to fight, they're about to learn I am far more dangerous than they imagine. And so, as the mourners drifted away and the cemetery emptied, I remained standing by the fresh mound of earth, staring at the coffin below. Not just in grief anymore, but in determination. I whispered to my husband, "Don't worry, love. I'll protect what we built. I'll protect our daughter, even if it's from herself." But in my heart, I knew this was only the beginning. Because if Daniel could whisper something like that at a funeral, then what else was he capable of? It had only been a week since we buried my husband, and yet it felt like years. The house, once filled with his laughter, his footsteps, his voice humming down the hallway, it was now painfully quiet. Every room echoed with absence. And that morning, as I brewed a pot of coffee I didn't even want, a heavy knock sounded at the door. When I opened it, there stood Mr. Harrison, 60-something, with silver hair and kind but tired eyes. He had been my husband's lawyer. And more importantly, his friend, for decades. His face carried the same grief mine did, but behind it was something sharper. Duty. "It's time, Margaret," he said softly. "The will needs to be read." My chest tightened. I wasn't ready for this, but I knew it had to be done. By noon, we were all gathered in the living room, me, Sophia, Daniel, and Mr. Harrison, who carried a thick folder of documents. The air was heavy, the silence brittle. I sat on the sofa, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across from me, Sophia perched on the armchair, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. Daniel, of course, looked perfectly comfortable, leaning back with an air of quiet expectation, like a man waiting to receive what he believed was his due. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. "My dear friend left this will very deliberately," he said. "Every word here was chosen with care." And then he read it. My husband had left the bulk of the estate, our home, his business shares, his savings, to me, to ensure my security and to honor the life we had built together. Sophia, however, was provided with a trust fund, a sizable one, but one that would be released gradually to protect her long-term future. I glanced at my daughter, waiting for her reaction. She didn't move. Not a single flicker crossed her face. But Daniel, oh Daniel, he couldn't hide it. For the first time since I'd known him, the mask cracked. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed just slightly, and his fingers drummed against the chair in agitation. He leaned forward, interrupting Mr. Harrison before he could even finish. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but edged with steel. "Surely there must be some mistake. Sophia is his daughter. She should inherit everything. Why place it all in Margaret's hands?" The room chilled. Mr. Harrison's brows furrowed. "No mistake. Your father-in-law was very clear. He wanted Margaret to be secure and Sophia protected. He set it up this way intentionally." Daniel pressed on. "But this arrangement, it feels unfair, restrictive. Why limit Sophia like this?" "Because," Mr. Harrison replied firmly, "your father-in-law loved his daughter enough to think long-term. He didn't want her to be vulnerable to poor influences or reckless decisions. He trusted Margaret to guide the family forward." My heart clenched at those words. Trusted me. Even in death, he was still placing his faith in me. But when I turned to Sophia, hoping to see gratitude or even comfort, all I saw was silence. Cold silence. She didn't speak up for me. She didn't defend me. She didn't even look at me. Her eyes were on Daniel. Always on Daniel. When the reading ended, Mr. Harrison packed his documents and offered me a reassuring nod before leaving. Daniel muttered a clipped, "Thank you," and barely waited for the door to close before he turned to Sophia, his voice low but sharp. "This isn't what we talked about," he hissed. "He's tied up everything. How are we supposed to?" I cleared my throat deliberately, and Daniel's face snapped back into its polished mask. He offered me a tight smile. "Of course, we're just processing, Margaret. It's a lot to take in." But I wasn't fooled. That evening, after they left, I found Sophia alone in the kitchen. I approached her carefully, hoping to bridge the growing distance between us. Sweetheart, I said gently, are you all right? I know today was difficult. Her shoulders stiffened. She didn't turn to me. I'm fine, she said curtly. You've been so quiet, you didn't even react to the will. I thought perhaps. And then she turned. Her eyes were cold, her lips curled in anger I hadn't seen before. You thought what? That I'd be grateful? That I'd thank you for keeping everything for yourself? The words hit me like a slap. Sophia, no, I whispered. It isn't like that. Your father wanted to make sure you'd always be safe. Safe? She snapped, or controlled. You always have to be in charge, don't you? Even now, you couldn't let him leave anything directly to me, could you? Her voice shook and behind that fury, I saw it, the echo of Daniel's influence, the way his words had slithered into her mind, twisting her against me. Tears stung my eyes. I would never hurt you, Sophia. You're my daughter, my only child. But she only shook her head, storming past me. I stood there in the silence of the kitchen, feeling my heart break all over again. Losing my husband had been unbearable. But losing my daughter, inch by inch, to the man she married, that was agony beyond words. Later that night, as I gathered myself enough to clean, I noticed something out of place. A crumpled piece of paper in the trash can, just barely visible beneath scraps of torn envelopes. I pulled it out, smoothing the wrinkles with trembling fingers. It was a letter, in my husband's handwriting. My breath caught. The words were short, hurried, but clear. Margaret, if something happens to me, do not trust Daniel. Protect Sophia, for she is blind to his influence. My knees nearly gave way. He had known. He had seen it too. The danger coiled behind Daniel's charm, the way he was slowly pulling our daughter into his grasp. And suddenly, the whisper I heard at the funeral no longer felt like grief-distorted paranoia. Now we have to deal with the old woman. No. It was real. It was a threat. And it meant one thing. Daniel was planning something far worse than I had ever imagined. And as I held that letter in my hands, I realized if I didn't act soon, I might lose more than my husband. I might lose my daughter. Or even my life. When my husband died, I thought the worst pain I would face was losing him. I was wrong. The pain of grief was sharp, yes, but at least it was honest. What came afterward was a different kind of agony. A shadowy, creeping torment that made me question my own reality. It started small. One morning, I checked my bank accounts and something was off. Transactions I didn't remember making, small withdrawals here, strange transfers there. I told myself it must have been a mistake, that maybe I was too distracted with grief to recall. But then it happened again, and again. And not just with money. I opened my pill box one evening to take my blood pressure medication, and I noticed the pills didn't look the same. The color was slightly different. The shape was off. My doctor had prescribed the same brand for years. I knew what they should look like. But when I asked the pharmacy, they told me no changes had been made. Someone had tampered with them. At first, I thought perhaps I was being paranoid. But then came the whispers. At church, a woman I had known for years placed her hand on mine and said softly, I hear you've been forgetful lately, Margaret. I hope you're taking care of yourself. Forgetful? I stared at her, stunned. And then another friend made a similar comment a week later. Word was spreading, about me. And I didn't need anyone to tell me where those whispers began. Daniel. It was his work, I was sure of it. Little seeds, carefully planted so people would start to question my mind. So that when the time came, he could point to the evidence and say, see, she's slipping. And worst of all, Sophia began to believe him. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I misplaced my reading glasses. It wasn't unusual, they were always slipping between sofa cushions or left on the kitchen counter. But when I asked Sophia if she'd seen them, she exchanged a glance with Daniel that twisted my stomach. Mom, she said carefully, you've been misplacing a lot of things lately. Maybe we should think about. Think about what? I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. Daniel's voice slid in smoothly, calm, measured. She only means maybe it's time to consider some help. Managing the estate, the house, it's a lot for one person, Margaret, and with everything you're going through. I cut him off. I am perfectly capable of handling myself, but Sophia looked unconvinced. And that look, my own daughter, doubting me, hurt worse than any accusation Daniel could throw. That night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something chilling. If I didn't act soon, Daniel would convince everyone I was losing my mind. And once that seed was planted firmly enough, he could have me declared unfit and take everything. I needed help. Someone who wasn't under Daniel's spell. That's when I called Liam. He was a private investigator recommended by an old friend. Mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with a quiet confidence that made me feel safe. I told him everything, the whisper at the funeral, the will, Sophia's distance, the tampered pills. He listened carefully, jotting notes, his jaw tightening as I spoke. "You're not crazy," he said finally. "This is a pattern, gaslighting, financial manipulation, classic signs of someone trying to push you out of the way." The relief that washed over me at those words nearly brought me to tears. Someone believed me. Someone saw what I saw. Liam promised to dig into Daniel's financial dealings, to track movements, accounts, anything suspicious. And I, in turn, promised to play my part. If Daniel wanted me to appear weak, confused, unstable, then I would give him exactly what he wanted. I began to act the part. I let my hands tremble when I picked up my tea. I forgot conversations, repeating questions I already knew the answers to. I stumbled over details, let my sentences trail off. And every time I saw Daniel's eyes gleam, just a little. He thought he was winning. Sophia, poor child, began to sigh in frustration, muttering about how difficult it was becoming to talk to me. Daniel would gently pat her hand, whispering that everything would be all right. But behind that mask of comfort, I saw his satisfaction. He thought he was breaking me down. He had no idea I was laying the trap. Still, the weight of the deception pressed on me every day, pretending to be weaker than I was, watching my daughter drift further away, holding back the truth of what I knew, waiting for Liam's findings. And then, one night, the mask slipped completely. I had risen quietly from bed, unable to sleep. As I walked past the study, I froze. Daniel's voice carried softly through the closed door. I leaned close, pressing my ear against the wood. "By next month, she'll be out of the picture. The estate will finally be ours." My blood turned to ice. Ours. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I covered my mouth, stifling the cry that threatened to escape. My own daughter's husband, plotting my removal, speaking of me like I was nothing more than an obstacle to be brushed aside. I slipped back down the hallway, my body trembling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the whole house. But then, in the safety of my darkened room, I whispered to myself, "You want me out of the picture? Then, I'll give you the performance of a lifetime." Because what Daniel didn't know was that I had already set the stage for his downfall. And the night I invited him and Sophia to dinner, the trap I had built so carefully was finally ready to be sprung. That evening, the air around the estate carried a strange stillness. The gardens, once alive with laughter and the smell of roses, now seemed muted, as if the very house itself knew a storm was about to break within its walls. I sat at the head of the grand dining table, my posture slightly hunched, my silver-streaked hair carefully brushed but allowed to fall just loosely enough to suggest frailty. The table before me was set meticulously, crystal glasses glinting in the chandelier's glow, polished silver cutlery lined in perfect order, and candles flickering in quiet defiance of the tension they were meant to soften. It looked like a feast, but in truth, it was a battlefield. Tonight would not just be dinner. Tonight would decide the fate of her family. My hands trembled slightly as I placed them in my lap. I allowed the tremor to remain, knowing full well it would feed into Daniel's growing belief that I was weakening, slipping further into age and confusion. A dangerous illusion, but one I intended to exploit. The sound of footsteps echoed down the marble hall. The door opened, and there they were. Sophia, my daughter, elegant but visibly anxious, and Daniel, my son-in-law, exuding the smug confidence of a man who thought he had already won. "Mother," Sophia greeted softly, her tone layered with forced calm. "Margaret," Daniel added smoothly, his eyes scanning the room like a predator entering familiar territory. "What a beautiful spread. You really didn't have to go through all this trouble." "Oh, but I wanted to," I said gently, my voice carrying a deliberate tremor. "It's been too long since we've sat together like a family. I thought, perhaps we could make peace." Daniel smiled, a thin-lipped curl that carried no warmth. "Peace. Yes, that's exactly what we all need." They sat. For a while, the clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound. Daniel poured the wine, offering me the glass with exaggerated courtesy. I accepted, letting my hand shake just enough for a droplet to spill onto the tablecloth. Daniel chuckled under his breath. Sophia, clearly unsettled, glanced at her husband. She had grown quieter with each passing day, I could see it, the way Daniel's dominance overshadowed her once bright spirit. As the meal continued, Daniel leaned closer to Sophia, his voice low but not so soft that I could not hear. "Darling," he said, "now would be a good time to discuss the future." Sophia hesitated, her fork pausing midair. "Go on," Daniel pressed, his hand covering hers in a gesture that looked tender but felt like a grip of iron. "Your mother deserves to hear it directly." Sophia's throat tightened. "Mother, Daniel and I, we've been thinking. It may be time to consider what's best for you. Perhaps having you legally declared unfit to manage the estate might protect you." I lowered my gaze, feigning confusion. "Unfit," I whispered. Daniel smirked, emboldened. "Yes, Margaret. It's nothing personal, but the house, the accounts, the responsibility, it's all far too much for you now. Don't you agree? It would be better if Sophia and I handled things, for your sake." He leaned back, savoring the moment. "It's not cruelty, it's practicality." I let a silence stretch, my frail act convincing enough that Daniel allowed himself a sip of wine and a victorious sigh. But then, I lifted my eyes. No longer cloudy, no longer weak. My gaze was sharp, clear, and unwavering. "Practicality," I repeated slowly, the word cutting like a blade. "Yes, I imagine that's what you'd call it." And then, with a subtle movement, I lifted my hand. The door at the far end of the dining room opened. Liam stepped inside, tall and steady, his presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere. And beside him, carrying a slim leather folder, was Mr. Harrison, the family's trusted lawyer. Daniel's smile faltered. "What's this?" I straightened in my chair, my frailty melting away like a mask. My voice, when I spoke, carried the authority of the woman who had once run this household with strength and dignity. "This," I said, "is the end of your games, Daniel." Mr. Harrison placed the folder on the table, opening it with precise movements. From within, he produced documents, printed transcripts, and a small recording device. The device clicked, and Daniel's own voice filled the room. "She's old, she won't notice a thing. Once she's out of the way, Sophia and I can finally take everything that should have been ours." Sophia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Another recording played. This time, Daniel's voice was darker, colder. "Poison is clean, untraceable. Just a matter of time. The old woman won't even know what happened." Sophia's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. "Daniel," she whispered, horrified. You said it was just talk, that you didn't mean." But Daniel's mask had already cracked, his face twisted, rage spilling out now that his secrets were laid bare. "You think she deserves this estate?" he snarled, jabbing a finger toward me. "She's clinging to power she no longer has. Everything she owns should be ours. I built plans for us, Sophia, for us, and she stood in the way." Liam moved closer, his voice firm. "Plans built on theft, fraud, and murder." Within moments, officers already waiting at the gate entered, summoned by Harrison. Daniel's fury erupted, his body thrashing as they clasped the cuffs onto his wrists. "You'll regret this," he screamed. "I should have gotten rid of you when I had the chance." His voice echoed through the grand dining hall as he was dragged away, his protests fading into the distance. For a long moment, silence blanketed the table. Only the flickering of candle flames remained. Sophia broke first. She collapsed into tears, her hands trembling as she turned to me. "Mother, I didn't know. I was blind. God, I betrayed you. I betrayed my own blood." I rose slowly, my face softening. I reached for my daughter, pulling her into an embrace. "Shh," I whispered. "You were misled, but you are my daughter. Nothing will ever change that." The two of us clung to each other, our tears mingling, grief, guilt, and a fragile hope for healing. When Sophia finally pulled back, her eyes swollen but clearer than before, I guided her gently toward my late husband's study. I unlocked the desk drawer, one that had remained sealed since his passing. Inside was a single envelope, sealed with my husband's familiar handwriting. I opened it, unfolding the letter with careful hands. My eyes scanned the words, and with each line my expression hardened. My husband had suspected Daniel for years, but what the letter revealed was far more chilling. Daniel had not been acting alone. Someone else in the family had aided him, someone who had yet to reveal themselves. I folded the letter, my jaw set. The storm, it seemed, was not over. And so, what began as a dinner for peace ended in betrayal, justice, and the revelation of even deeper secrets. Margaret may have saved her daughter and preserved her husband's legacy tonight, but the battle for truth was far from finished. Another shadow still lurked within the family, waiting. If you've been captivated by this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good twist, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what happens next. Because trust me, this story has only just begun.